Hello, everyone. Welcome to another exciting, dynamic conversation with the Allentown Art Museum. My name is Abby, and I'm going to be your host tonight. This evening, I'm very excited that we have two world-renowned scholars with us to discuss our Rembrandt and the complex attribution process. We'll start out with some questions from our moderator, Elaine Mehalakes, and at the end of the program, we'll also have time for questions from the audience. So please, if you have questions at any point along the way, enter those into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. Up first, we have our moderator, Elaine Mehalakes. Elaine Mehalakes is the Vice President of Curatorial Affairs at the Allentown Art Museum, and she is the curator of the exhibition Rembrandt Revealed. Thanks for moderating tonight, Elaine.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Arthur Wheelock. Arthur K. Wheelock Jr. is Senior Advisor to the Leiden Collection. He recently retired as Curator of Northern Baroque Painting at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and as Professor of Art History at the University of Maryland. During his tenure at the National Gallery from 1975 to 2018, he oversaw a significant expansion of the Dutch and Flemish collection. He also organized over 40 exhibitions, including Anthony van Dyck, Johannes Vermeer, Rembrandt's late religious portraits, Jan Lievens and Vermeer and the Masters of Genre Painting. Among Wheelock's books are catalogs of the National Gallery's Dutch and Flemish paintings. Wheelock holds numerous awards and distinctions in his field, including in 2006, the Belgian government named him Commander in the Order of Leopold I. In 2015, Williams College awarded him the Kellogg Award for Lifetime Career Achievement. And in 2018, he received an honorary degree of Doctor of Art from Dickinson College. Thanks so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Wheelock.
Thank you, Abby.
And last but not least, we have Dr. Stephanie Dickey. Stephanie Dickey is Professor of Art History and Bader Chair in Northern Baroque Art at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. She has published and lectured around the world on art of the early modern Netherlands, especially the work of Rembrandt van Rijn and his circle. She also researches and teaches on the history of portraiture, the history of prints and print collecting, and representations of gender and emotion. Stephanie is currently serving as guest curator for the exhibition Rembrandt in Amsterdam, Creativity and Competition, scheduled to open at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa in May 2021, and at the Stadel Museum in Frankfurt, Germany in October 2021. She co-edited the exhibition catalog, which will be available through Yale University Press beginning in April. Thanks so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Dickey.
Very nice to be here.
So with that out of the way, I'll pass it to you, Elaine.
Thank you, Abby. Tonight's discussion has been organized in conjunction with the exhibition Rembrandt Revealed, which explores the history, conservation, and attribution of Rembrandt's 1632 painting, Portrait of a Young Woman, in the collection of the Allentown Art Museum. In February of 2018, the museum sent Portrait of a Young Woman, then attributed to Rembrandt's workshop, to the Conservation Center of the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, where it underwent nearly 2 years of study and conservation supported by the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. The results of this process led to a reconsideration of the authorship of the painting, which we will discuss in greater depth here. In this slide, you're looking at a portrait of a young woman from the Allentown Art Museum collection from 1632, and a Rembrandt self-portrait from the same year. The two had been paired in the 18th century when they were in the collection of the Duc d'Orléans in Paris. Stephanie and Arthur, Rembrandt is one of the most renowned artists of all time. I'd like to ask both of you, as scholars who've explored Rembrandt's work throughout your careers, what is it about his work that continues to engage you? Stephanie, would you like to start?
Sure. I've been working on Rembrandt ever since I wrote my PhD dissertation. We're not quite as long as Arthur, but almost. And I find that there's always something new to discover about Rembrandt. He was an extraordinarily versatile artist, and he was that in an era when many people were specializing in one type of painting or another. So he painted all different kinds of subjects. He was also a remarkable printmaker, maybe one of the most innovative printmakers of all time, a wonderful draftsman, and an artist who really followed his own authentic vision, even when it wasn't fashionable, which is something that you can't say for every artist of his time. So within the standards of his time, he really was quite an original and special figure, I think. There's always something new to find out. And also he was a tremendously gifted teacher. And that's sort of what brings us to where we are with all these questions about paintings that might or might not be by Rembrandt, because he taught many other artists to paint almost as well as he does. So it poses questions sometimes. Even his own contemporaries sometimes couldn't tell the difference.
And Arthur, how about you?
Well, there's so many things, as Stephanie was mentioning, that are so compelling about Rembrandt. But one of the things I find fascinating is that we feel like we know this guy. There are so many self-portraits, and there are so many images of Saskia and Hendrika, his family, his Titus, his son, that they're and the self-portraits are in paintings, prints, and drawings. And there is a connection that we have with him, and we know stories about his life and mythologies, and so there is a kind of personal relationship that one develops over the centuries with him that I find really compelling. And it's sort of every painting somehow feels as though it tells a story. So there's a personal side of the artist that I think is beyond all things that Stephanie mentioned, is really very, very much why he connects. And I think your painting, can I continue on with your painting? Because I think it's so interesting what the two paintings you have on the screen right now. So this is Rembrandt's self-portrait. So this is an image of Rembrandt as a young guy, 1632 or so, in that same time. And your painting, 1632, they were actually not painted together. But this interest in relationships that we're talking about was something that has been part of history all the way since the 17th century, because the Duc d'Orléans had these two paintings in his collection, and he said, one's Rembrandt, the other's got to be Saskia, his wife. And so they made them a pair. They changed slightly the size of the woman, who's not Saskia, but it was close enough, looks enough like what we think Saskia looks like, that they made him a pair. So that they gave her the name of Rembrandt's wife, just to make that relationship. So that is a very kind of instance of that history, personal history, engaging people all the way from the 18th century on to today.
So Rembrandt, people have a stake in his work, so to speak. And so attribution, even more generally than Rembrandt, ascribing a work to a particular artist, how is that determined, and why is it important? Arthur, would you like to speak to that?
Well, it's interesting in lots of different ways. Attributions is something we deal with all the way through art history, but with Rembrandt, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Stephanie mentioned, he has a large workshop, and there is a large part of the history of Rembrandt, and particularly one from the 17th century, but reinforced in the 19th century, that has had a lot to do with the way we respond to Rembrandt, is the feeling that Rembrandt had a special way of handling paint, that he could do things with his paint that nobody else could. And all the way in the 17th century and 16, about the same time, Rembrandt and Leemans are visited by Constantine Howkins, who was a connoisseur of the time and was especially involved in the court in The Hague, and he wanted acquisitions for the court. And he came to visit Rembrandt, and he mentioned that Rembrandt creates in his paintings that could capture the soul of the sitter in his paintings. And so that was something that was special to Rembrandt. And that feeling of that special quality is picked up in the Romantic era, that Rembrandt is somehow different than everybody else in his workshop. And so the ones that with a soul, the ones that had captured the special qualities, was Rembrandt, and everything else must be one of the students. And so right from the as art history was beginning, really in the 19th century, that becomes the determining feature in the attribution world. That what is Rembrandt and what is not, it has to do with quality, and that has to do with effects of light and dark and brushwork, all these things that enter into the discussions.
And Stephanie, do you have other thoughts about the importance of attribution?
Yes, I think on a general level, I would say it's very important for the scientific understanding of any artist, kind of how he did what he did. And we know that, as Arthur mentioned, Rembrandt had a sort of almost alchemical approach to paint. He put the paint on the surface in a way that was quite experimental and unusual for his time. But again, to come back to the notion of his teaching, he taught other students, he taught more than 40 other artists who attempted to emulate some of those techniques. So by scientific analysis, we're getting more and more sophisticated in the tools that we can use to try to deduce which hand put the mark on the surface. One of the problems that arises is that sometimes he may have had his assistants help him in the completion of a particular panel. So, and this is something it's taken a long time for scholars to admit, even though many other workshops operated this way, that there would be assistants who did part of the work and then the master would finish it. So there's that complication. I think the other reason people care so much nowadays, honestly, is because of market value. If an object is by Rembrandt, it's worth millions and millions. If it's by some unnamed follower, you could probably buy it on eBay. Well, that's an exaggeration, but the point is, people really care about names, and they even did in his time too. His student Hoogstraten wrote about people who think that they're connoisseurs, but they're really just not name buyers. They'll buy something because it has a famous name, the way you buy designer jeans. So that comes to my third point, which is that if you own a painting and you love it and you enjoy having it on your wall, that's what matters. And it's the very same object, whether it's by a certain artist or not. So, you know, these are questions that are intriguing, and they'll keep us all in business for many years. But at bottom, is it a beautiful painting? Is it a wonderful thing to look at? That's what really matters, I think.
I mean, just to state exactly how contentious Rembrandt attributions have been, they have ranged from as few as 250 works credited to the artist to as many as 700. So that's certainly quite a range over time. And I think that both of you have dealt with Rembrandt attributions in the past, and Arthur, we're looking at our painting and a painting from the National Gallery of Art's collection, both of which had questions about their attribution. And I wondered if you could speak to that.
Sure, this is fascinating because both of these paintings were in the Duc d'Orléans collection in the late 18th century, both sold in England in the early 19th century. And they're very prized Rembrandts at that time. And both of them, the attributions of the Allentown, the Portrait of a Young Woman, and the Mill, have gone from very highly praised, valued paintings to rejection, and now back into the Rembrandt orbit. So it's fascinating ups and downs of connoisseurship that one sees often in works of art. They don't always go one direction or the other. That change in what one accepts as Rembrandt is really a fascinating study that we don't have time for here, but something of that has to do with condition and with varnishes and the changing colors of varnishes, because over time, all these paintings will have had a natural resin varnish applied to them, and over time, natural resin varnishes become matte and they darken, and it changes the character of the image. And so the young woman, for example, unless loses her pink cheeks when you have yellow varnish. And the mill no longer has a blue sky. It has a brown sky because you have discolored varnish, many layers of varnish on it. And so that, oh, then it feels funny. It feels different. It doesn't feel like what you think Rembrandt ought to be. So that has, then the people kind of, if it doesn't really speak to you in a way that it's supposed to, it doesn't capture the soul of the landscape or soul of a figure, then somehow it maybe is not right. And so then people then start to question, find different reasons to doubt the work. And so that's when you get into what Stephanie was talking about, that all the conservation examinations, the technical examinations, the new techniques of understanding the kinds of paints. Are they 17th century paints? Are they later paints? What's the layering of paints? Are they consistent with what we know Rembrandt did? But lots sorts of questions that go into the broader study of a work of art with conservation labs, either within a museum or special ones, such as where the Allentown painting was restored.
Stephanie, these are two paintings from the collection at Queen's University where you're a professor, and they have an interesting story. Can you share that with us?
Yes, we have a small museum here on campus. We're a town of 150,000, just north of Syracuse, New York. Like a remarkable number of regional museums in North America, we have a pocket of excellence, which is based on one collector's passion. And our pocket of excellence happens to be Dutch paintings, because Alfred Bader, who was a Queen's alumnus and then later founded the Sigma Aldrich Chemical Company, was a passionate collector of Dutch art for over 50 years. And he honored his university by giving his collection over those many years to our museum on campus. So we now have 4 paintings by Rembrandt that he and his family have given us. These are 2 of them, and they make a terrific teaching combination because they're a very similar subject. Rembrandt, from the time that he was very young, was fascinated by images of old age. He shared this with his friend and colleague Jan Levens. Even when they were in their 20s, they were painting images of old men over and over again. I think they liked the technical challenge of trying to describe the wrinkles and the scraggly beard and things like that. So Dr. Bader was able to buy both of these paintings long ago on the art market when they were among the many works that the research team called the Rembrandt Research Project had challenged as being perhaps by a follower rather than by Rembrandt himself. And research over time has shown that in fact they are by the master, at least we certainly believe them to be. But if you can at some point zoom in on these 2 images, you'll be able to see that the technique is extremely different between the 2. And this is another thing that brings up a challenge for connoisseurs of Rembrandt. The one on the right with the dark cap was painted just probably before your Allentown painting. And there's a kind of meticulous care with which he's describing the details of the face and the beard particularly. The one on the left, 30 years later, he's painting with a broader brush with thicker paint. By then he was painting portraits so thick that one critic said later on that you could pick them up by the nose. So he's using, his technique changes radically over the course of his career. And so that's another thing you have to learn about as a scholar of Rembrandt. At what point in his career was the work painted? And meanwhile, he had these generations of followers, and they would learn whatever style it was he was offering at the particular moment that they were in the workshop. So there's a lot of variety among them too. But these are great examples of paintings that have gone in and out of the Rembrandt canon. And fortunately for us, they're now back in.
This next slide shows a group of paintings made around 1632, including the Allentown Museum's portrait of a young woman. They all appear to present the same model. Stephanie, can you provide some background on what we're seeing here?
This is an interesting cluster because you can see that Rembrandt was clearly using the same model repeatedly, or let's say the same model was posing for him repeatedly. Although there's always artistic license, it doesn't mean he made her look exactly like herself every time. You can see slight variations from one to the other. But it's clearly, these figures are all based on essentially the same person. Who was that person? We don't know. It's a mystery. Some people believe that she was his sister, Lisbeth. But most of these paintings date from right around 1632. This is the moment when he's moving from his hometown of Leiden to settle in Amsterdam to take up a place in the workshop of an art dealer called Hendrik Allenberg. This is also a moment when he's changing from being an artist who's focusing entirely on history painting and some genre paintings, and suddenly starts painting portraits. So are these, your official title of your painting is Portrait of a Woman, Portrait of a Young Woman, but in a very specific sense, it isn't necessarily a portrait in the way that you and I would go and have a formal photograph taken for our wedding or graduation or something like that. It's more of a generic figure, which in Dutch is called a tronie. Using costume that's a little bit fanciful to take that model and transport her into a sort of fantasy realm. So whoever this woman was, she was willing to pose for all these kind of fanciful images, which clearly there was a market for them because Rembrandt made a lot of them.
So throughout its first 3 centuries, the Allentown Art Museum's portrait of a young woman was accepted and recorded and published as having been painted by Rembrandt. And around 1970, scholars from the Rembrandt Research Project removed the painting from the canon of the master, stating it was more likely the work of another artist in Rembrandt's studio. And the cleaning and conservation that happened in 2018 and 19 prompted a reconsideration of who had made it. And here we're looking at, on the left, the painting after conservation, and on the right, the painting during conservation, in which you can see the effects of the discolored and degraded varnish on the one side. And here we're looking at the portrait and a detail of it. And we started to talk a little bit about Rembrandt's technique and his manner of painting. Arthur, could you speak to this painting and its details in relation to what we know about Rembrandt's manner of painting?
Sure. Well, first of all, it was wonderfully restored by Sean Kwan, who did also a wonderful program for you. And that would be something I would recommend anybody to look at, because it really explains the process by which she cleaned the work and the discoveries that she was making on in the process. So kudos to her for her wonderful job. I find this, the 2 slides you showed, the one with this half clean face, let me go back that for a second and come back to this one in a moment, because it's really interesting to sort of feature here. It's very easy to see where the varnish has been removed. I just want to point that out so everybody can focus on the painting that probably many of you who visit the Allentown Museum have seen the painting, and it's very lovely as it was, but now with the varnish removed, you can see the different flesh tones and the pinks of the cheek that I was talking about, and the softness of the hair, and all these elements come through. But what essentially happens is that you feel a figure who suddenly speaks to you much more directly than she ever could before. She was sort of behind this film and a little bit not quite there, but with that varnish removed, the discolored varnish removed, then you feel a connecting quality to this image that is really the essence of what Rembrandt's portraits or tronies elegant throny. We're going to call it a portrait for the moment because it's just easier rather than using the word trony, which is a complicated concept. But anyhow, a portrait of a lady that is really a generic lady, as Stephanie says, who was probably appealing in the image for some collector who wanted some lovely person in their home. You know, wake up in the morning and there's somebody smiling at you, that's happy that you're coming down for breakfast, kind of thing. But one of the interesting things that the painting has been doubted, and this is the attribution question that is something that is part of what we want to discuss today, is that when you see this slide, you can see that the face is more smoothly modeled than the lace collar over her shoulder and the gold necklace around her. So that there's a distinction, quite a pronounced distinction in the sense of finish in the face and in the collar. And so the question that Stephanie raised, that Rembrandt might have other people working on his paintings, has been raised with this work, whether or not Rembrandt did the face and the collar, or just the face, or maybe not even the face or not the collar. I mean, there's all sorts of manifestations of that discussion. I think when the varnish has been removed, you can see the persona come through. That is at the essence of what Rembrandt does, and the brushwork is all consistent with his manner, the modeling of the eyes, the nose, and the blueness of the shadow in the by the mouth is all part of the flesh tone qualities that he has. But if you go to the next slide, which I find very interesting, the more I was thinking about this painting with and discussion with Stephanie about it, the more I became absolutely convinced that the entirety of this work is by Rembrandt, and that feeling came about through the light, the sense of light and shade of the lace collar. Because when you get away from the painting, you see in the close-up how the free brushwork that you have there. And you get away from it, then that shadow that feels like the collar, the lace collar lies down gently on her shoulders, a kind of an overarching focus of light in the middle, but over the shoulders it's shaded so that it feels like a fabric that has just fallen very softly on her. And I find this very important in that one of the things that makes a figure, what the challenge of painting a portrait is to give a sense of the inner life, what Hawkins talks about the soul, and that feeling of a person living and breathing. And to me, that softness of the way that collar has been done makes that happen with this painting. It really is an essential element of this work that I think is very beautifully rendered, and it's something that Rembrandt did in a very free form way, but he knew how the light and dark would work. And his ability to change styles within one work, so it's not just a matter of early paintings are done this way and late ones another way. He could shift back and forth within the work itself to give different qualities of paint. And we know at this point in time, 1632, he's just moved to Amsterdam to work in a workshop of portraits of artist dealer by the name of Hendrik van Allenberg. But there is nobody in Amsterdam painting in this free way that would have done this. This has to be Rembrandt, who could make those shifts in character of his own, in his own style.
That's fascinating. The other thing that we found out from the technical examinations that were conducted at the Conservation Center was that the signature was integral to the original paint layer. Stephanie, do you have thoughts about this signature?
Well, it is an important clue. My teacher many years ago used to say the easiest thing to fake is a signature. And in a way that's true, but now that we have sophisticated methods of technical analysis, if it is a fake signature, you can usually tell because it will have been inscribed on top of a layer of varnish or something like that that was put on when the painting itself was finished. So Sean mentioned this in her presentation, that it's in the original paint layer. So in other words, the signature was added while the paint was still wet. And that's a good clue that it's from the original time period. The other thing is, the list on the left is a great example of how Rembrandt, as a very young artist, really played around with how to sign his work. And ultimately, he ends up with what you see at the bottom. In 1633, once he's well established in Amsterdam, he starts using the name we all know and love, Rembrandt. What's interesting about that is that he was the only Dutch artist of his time who used his first name in that way. He's following from the great artists of the Italian Renaissance, such as Titian and Raphael and Michelangelo, who used their first names. Most of his contemporaries, we were joking about this the other day when I was talking with Arthur about it, and most of his Dutch contemporaries are called Jan or Jacob or something like that. And if that's your name, you can't get very far trying to be distinctive with that name. But Rembrandt was lucky. His parents gave him a very unusual name. So that became his way of, another way, besides his remarkable style, in which he distinguished himself from many other artists of his time. Now, that said, if you're going to fake a Rembrandt signature, you want it to say Rembrandt, not this weird whatever this is, which happens to be RHL, Rembrandt Harmenson from Leiden, van Rijn, his family name. He only used this signature in 1632 or closely thereabouts. So it's not, if you're going to pick a signature that's going to be convincing, that's probably not the one you're going to pick. So for all these reasons, this is a very important clue that he painted this work and he was proud of it enough to put his own name on it in 1632.
Do you have anything to add to that, Arthur?
No, I think Stephanie handled that perfectly. I think it is absolutely not a signature anybody would put on later on. They wouldn't know that specific. They wouldn't have that chart on the left about the right signature to put on. So it's absolutely crucial bit of evidence.
We're taking a closer look at one of the paintings that seems to be of the same model, one that is in the Leiden collection, in which you've written about extensively, Arthur. How would you compare these two?
Well, I think it's a wonderful comparison, and I'm delighted you have it up on the screen because they are undoubtedly the same model that Rembrandt has also painted in 1632. It's exactly the same signature. So it is. We know that they are done the same time. They are both. They're two different challenges. Rembrandt was challenging himself all the time. How do you make a figure feel alive? And we mentioned that with the Allentown painting, with the way the collar floats down, and it sort of gives a feeling of breathing painting. Rembrandt on the other one, the one on the right, has a slightly different approach, which is manipulating the light and dark in the background to a much greater extent. The background in the Allentown painting is pretty much consistent dark, but on the Leiden collection painting, it's darker on the left and has a kind of the earring on the left is over a dark background, and the earring on the right is a dark earring over a light background. And so you have this sort of shifting quality. She looks like she's central, but if you look at her shoulders, they slightly tilted. So she's twisted slightly in space and has a kind of frizzy hair that comes up and gives her a lifelike quality in a both of them are quiet figures. They're not moving, they're not gesturing, they're not smiling broadly, but they feel very much alive. And they show two different ways that Rembrandt can give that same effect with slightly different techniques.
Stephanie, now we're showing a painting in the National Gallery of Canada's collection. And we're very excited to be able to loan our painting to the show that you're planning, Rembrandt in Amsterdam, Creativity and Competition. And again, this seems to be the same model. And I wondered if you could speak to these or to why you wanted to have our painting from Allentown in the exhibition.
Well, we're very excited to be able to bring it to Ottawa, where our exhibition will be. I mean, there have been a million probably exhibitions about Rembrandt in the world. Ours is the first one ever to take place at the National Gallery of Canada. It's the first really major loan show of Rembrandt in Canada since 1969, which is quite remarkable. And our theme really focuses in on how this transition from Leiden to Amsterdam really pushed him into a new environment, a very competitive and very creative environment where he was surrounded by other talents. And that really, I think, inspired him to continue to innovate and grow and become the artist that we know today. This painting is the one treasure by Rembrandt from that period, which is in the National Gallery. And it is most likely the same model. So it's a fascinating opportunity to examine these two paintings together. And we're also very privileged to be bringing the painting from the Leiden collection to Ottawa. And we're going to hang it and the Allentown painting side by side. So we're very excited that this will be the first time, the comparison that Arthur just described, this will be the first time since your painting was cleaned that people can make that comparison with their own two eyes. So I think if you point your car straight north and drive for about 9 hours, you could get to Ottawa, assuming, God willing, the border is open again by May or June or July or August. So I hope a lot of people will come and see.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you both so very much. And let's see what questions we have.
I see one question in the chat. Someone responded to my comment about his change in technique and says, did Rembrandt's change in technique have any influence from his own aging, for example, a decline in eyesight? It's an interesting question that people often ask about artists who lived for a long time, like Monet or Titian. You get the same kinds of questions. I can't tell you the number of medical articles that exist about Rembrandt. People have tried to diagnose his personality and his skin disease and his eyesight and God knows what from his many self-portraits especially. But I think there's more to it than that. I think he was, like Titian, like Michelangelo, an artist who at the end of his life just doesn't sweat the small stuff. He's just drilling down to the things that he thinks really matter. His compositions get simpler. He's still playing with paint in all kinds of interesting ways, but he's not fussing with details or extraneous backgrounds. He's just painting what really matters to him. And that's really, I think, essential for a lot of artists in maturity who continue to evolve and innovate as they get older. They're going to paint what really matters to them. And I think that's what he was doing.
Can I join in there a bit? I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it. But the one thing I think we should be aware of or emphasize a bit is that Rembrandt is looking at nature, studying figures, but he is very much aware of artistic traditions. He actually was a major collector himself of the prints and drawings and paintings. And one of the artists, and he looked a lot at Italian Renaissance and that world you see impacting his style at various periods of his career. And later on, more and more, he gets very influenced. He sees paintings by Titian, and there's a broad handling of paint in Titian's work that I think also plays a very strong role in the evolution of Rembrandt's own approach to figures and you name it all in this history paintings. I mean, what Stephanie is showing in this your history painting in the comparison in your exhibition, that is a small painting, a relatively small painting, and later on in his career, they get much larger. And some of the handling of paint is also appropriate for difference of scale. And so that is something else. I mean, we see all these slides on the screen, they're all the same size, but basically when you go to in real life, you'll see very differences in scale, and that makes a big difference in the way they're handled.
We had another question about, were there other examples in which Rembrandt used the same model for multiple works?
There are quite a few. There's an older man with a sort of bald head who turns up often in his work right around this same period, actually. And the legend in the Romantic 19th century was that that person was his father. There's an old woman who often is wearing a sort of colorful headscarf. People used to like to imagine that was his mother, and it might be, but we don't know for sure. But especially when he was young, he tended to use and reuse those models. Later in his life, when he moved to Amsterdam and he married Saskia van Allenberg, who was related to his business partner, Hendrik, Saskia becomes his sort of ideal woman, and either she or some version of her is frequently appearing. And then later on in life, his late life partner, Hendrik Stoffel, she becomes a frequent model. So many artists at that time turned to the people in their immediate vicinity as frequent sources of inspiration. And Rembrandt did that clearly as
one
well.
Of the models he particularly liked to use multiple times is himself. So he appears in a lot of his paintings as an actor in this painting. So that this, so there's a very much a broad. When I started out mentioning the importance of the narrative and knowing Rembrandt, and to see where these figures appear and what kind of history paintings, what kind of other personas they have, is also part of his own life story. Why does Hendrika appear in certain subjects, and does that have something to do with situations in her life that were going on, that maybe that those subjects start the impact on those stories of Rembrandt's life in the broader family scope have impact on the kind of subjects he painted. Because that was really what history paintings were ways of understanding contemporary world. That was one thing that was very important to think about, why history painting, why certain subjects were being were valued, and they had a lot to do with the moral and ethical issues that people were facing in their own lives in the 17th century.
One of our viewers says, I'm fascinated with this idea of artist as alchemist. What was Rembrandt's paint palette like? Was it fairly consistent, or did his preferred pigments and materials tend to change along with his style?
I'll say something quickly, but Arthur probably knows more, because for many years he's been in the conservation lab watching people uncover the mysteries of Rembrandt. But his palette changes a little bit. He at the very beginning, he's using brighter colors inspired by his own teacher, Peter Lastmann. But his palette gets more and more reductive over the course of his career, I think. Towards the end, it's mostly just very earthy reds and browns and black and white. And why he did that, again, it's kind of similar to what happened with the Italian Renaissance artist Titian, who Arthur mentioned. But it seems, again, to be a way of just sort of distilling things down to what he thinks is most important. I used alchemy there in a sort of poetic sense, although alchemy was very popular in Rembrandt's time, and there were prominent people who believed in it. So that's a whole nother conversation.
I find that question is very interesting. And I'm going to take it out of Rembrandt's own world, just to put it back into the Allentown paintings experience and the cleaning of that painting, because that was much more restrictive palette before it was cleaned. It had a kind of yellowish, brownish glow, that. And when I came to the National Gallery in 1973, there are 20-some Rembrandts there on the wall. Every one of them was brown. Every one of them was brown on a brown wall, a brown frame. And over time, the painting's been cleaned. So actually, the Rembrandt we know today is a very different Rembrandt than he was, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So over time, paintings have been cleaned. We see these colors, that we see the early colors, the very bright colors that Stephanie's talking about, the early Rembrandt, but also the richer, deeper colors and the gold. I mean, Rembrandt could create amazing effects of glitter, of gold, of a costume that with his chiaroscuro effects that really come out of the darkness behind them. So those things were dimmed with their dirty varnish. So with the Lucretia painting we have in the National Gallery, that has transformed in the restoration. And so these things, the pinks on the cheeks, all these things that give that color, that inner life qualities of the works that are so important.
There was a period when conservators were deliberately cleaning 17th century paintings and then adding a tinted varnish over them because the tradition was that they were supposed to look brown. And it's taken time to realize that that isn't always necessarily the case. And in your painting, you can see the difference between the way he puts that sort of very almost translucent white paint for the color, and then the gold that Arthur's talking about is already there with the chain. It's sort of he uses thick impasto and then a glaze over the top of it, so that there's kind of a reflection of the lighter color underneath coming through the glaze, and it makes it sparkle, and it makes it almost sculptural in the sense that the paint is kind of thick little dots of thickness. So he's really thinking almost in sculptural terms with paint, and that's part of what's remarkable.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for your insight. And thank you everyone for your attention and your questions. And Abby, I will turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Elaine. I would also like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And I would like to give a very, very special thank you to Arthur and Stephanie for being with us tonight and sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience. It really was an absolute honor to have you both here. I'd also like to thank Elaine Mehalakes for moderating the conversation and for all of your incredibly hard work bringing the Rembrandt back to the Allentown Art Museum and for shining a light on this work. We really couldn't do it without the three of you. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Elaine.
Oh, I was just going to remind people to please come to the Allentown Art Museum to see the exhibition if you have a chance before May 2nd. Rembrandt Revealed, and I also want to thank our sponsors for supporting the exhibition, including the Richard C. von Hess Foundation and the County of Lehigh.
Thanks, Elaine. Absolutely. Yes, if you haven't had the chance to see it in person, now until May 2nd, it'll be up. And we are currently open Friday through Sunday, 11 a.m. until 4 p.m. So please, please, please stop by and see it in person if you can. And one last quick note, if you're looking for more ways to connect with the museum virtually, we have an event called Inspired Word with Basement Poetry happening next Saturday, February 27th at 6 p.m. And if you're looking for more information on our Rembrandt, we have another dynamic conversation available on our YouTube featuring the conservator, Sean King, which delves into the conservation process that the painting went through, and it is fascinating. So I highly suggest checking that out. And if you're looking for any more information on our exhibitions or on our programming, you can get all of the information at our website at allentownartmuseum.org. Again, thank you all so much for being with us. Thank you again, Arthur and Stephanie and Elaine. Have a great night, everyone, and we hope to see you at the museum soon.